Hey everyone, I want to do something a little different in this video. Instead of telling you what I think is happening in this war, which I did in the video I made earlier today about where America is striking. If you haven't seen that video, I think it's an important one. But instead of telling you what I think is happening, I want to show you what Iran itself is telling its own people. Because when you read state media from a regime like this, you're not reading news. I've said this many times. One of the nice things, not nice things, one of the helpful things about totalitarian regimes where there is not freedom of the press is that their state media is actually revealing. It's meaning it's a press release. If I look at a particular American media outlet, I don't know the trajectory or I don't see the strategy of the US government necessarily because there's freedom of the press. But when you read state media of a totalitarian regime, you're actually, if you read it critically, if you read it carefully, you have a window into what they're thinking. And in this case, we can tell what the Iranians are afraid of right now, what's giving them anxiety. Now, if you're new to the channel, I do this a lot. I read Iranian state media every day. And I said this before, I'm not reading it because I believe it. I'm reading it because, as I said, this is the window in. So right now, what we're going to see is that they're spending a lot of ink reassuring their own people about something. And that tells you what's keeping them up at night. So over the last 3 days, WANA, that's one of my go-to Iranian state media outlets. It's WANA stands for West Asia News Agency. It's an arm of the regime. And they put out 3 separate pieces that are kind of like analyzing strategy. One of them is on whether the U.S. is planning a ground operation, like a ground invasion, whether the U.S. is planning that. One is on why the U.S. just started bombing bridges. And one of them is laying out where they think the war is headed. So I want to walk through these one at a time. And I'm going to read a few sections. I'm not going to read these full articles. They're all long pieces. We're just going to read some choice sections of them so that I can show you exactly what's giving away and what their messaging is. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at, here, let me pull this all up on screen. I guess I should do that. Here we go. So the first one we're going to look at is this one here. Is the United States considering a ground operation in Tehran? That's what it's called. So look how this piece opens. Look how it starts. In recent days, following reports in U.S. media about the consideration of options such as seizing some Iranian islands in the Persian Gulf, a familiar question has once again entered the public debate. Is Washington actually approaching a ground operation against Iran, or is this scenario less a real military plan and more a tool of psychological warfare and political pressure? And notice they bolded that. Okay, so this is what triggers the whole article. It wasn't that that Iran suddenly had this rumor that there's going to be a ground operation. It was that the U.S. media reports about seizing Iranian islands, meaning in U.S. media, they start talking about the possibility of seizing Iranian islands in the Gulf, and that triggered the Iranians. And notice the framing. They immediately try to downgrade it to psychological warfare, and that's a tell. You don't spend an entire article debunking the psychological warfare unless the psychological warfare is working. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump all the way to the end of the article, and then I'm going to go back. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and look at a couple pieces in the middle of it, because I want you to see where, what the frame of the whole article is. We're going to jump all the way to the final passage of it now. Like I said, it's a long piece. And here, just right at the end, a ground operation against Iran, even if considered as a pressure tool or a negotiating instrument, would face a combination of military, political, and logistical risks that make the decision extremely difficult, because wars are not defined only by how forces enter a battlefield. They are ultimately defined by whether those forces can sustain their position and whether they have a realistic path to leave. That's the closing line of the piece. Read that again. This isn't analysis for analysis' sake. This is reassurance. It's written for, and I should say, a lot of this stuff is originally in Persian and then translated and put on the English websites. This is written for a reader who is anxious and worried and looking at the regime and saying, ooh, are we actually going to win this thing? It's written for, let's say, an Iranian reader who's scared that, or pro-Iranian reader who's scared that the Americans are about to land troops on Iranian soil. And the message is, don't worry, the Americans can't hold ground that they take, even if they take it. Okay? So that's the frame of the piece. Now, I want to show you another quote from here. Okay? Let's backtrack and pull back what I want here. Where is it? It's all the way up here. The United States spent months preparing before launching its invasion of Iraq in 2003. They're talking about Iraq. They're talking about the U.S. invasion of Iraq 23 years ago. The United States spent months preparing before launching its invasion of Iraq in 2003. Iran, however, presents a different challenge. Its geographic size, defensive structure, decades of experience dealing with external threats, and its geopolitical importance make any ground operation a far more difficult undertaking. Okay, that's what they're saying here. A far more complex undertaking, right? In geographic size, defensive structure, decades of experience, its geopolitical importance make any ground operation far more complex undertaking. Okay, so they're reaching back to 2003 and they're making the following argument, right? They're making this argument that this is going to be much harder. Why are they doing that? Because Iraq is the ghost in the room, right? It's also for Americans. They also are messaging to the American audience that, like, oh, you don't want to get bogged down in another Iraq, because they know that America is traumatized by Iraq, by the forever war. And also every Iranian who lived through that era remembers what a full American ground invasion of a Middle Eastern country actually looked like. So Juana's working really hard to say, yeah, that happened, but that's not us. We're different. Right? In other words, what they did to Iraq, they can't do to us. But the fact that they have to say it tells you that the comparison is worrying them. Look, so the bottom line on this point is that Iran isn't worried about America coming in and totally occupying, and which isn't even really an option anyway. Even Juana would admit that that's not realistic. What they're worried about is something smaller and more specific, a limited grab, like taking those Gulf islands used as a bargaining chip, and they can't rule it out, right? So look at this next line here. Look at this next line here. Where is it? Where they ask the question. So is a ground operation completely off the table? The most accurate answer is no. In politics and warfare, no option can be completely ruled out. Right? That's the regime media here admitting in print that they cannot promise their own people that this won't happen. So throughout this piece, what I'm saying here, just to sum up, just in case I'm being confusing, jumping around, there's a lot of anxiety in this piece. There's a lot of worry in this piece. There's a lot of reassuring. And what their concern is America launching a ground operation to seize islands. Okay? That is, you see it right there. They are worried about this. Now let's take a look at the second piece that I want to show you. And this is from the 18th of the month. So it's from 2 days ago. And this is the hidden strategy behind U.S. strikes on Iran's bridges. So this is about, again, as it says, about the U.S. hitting bridges and roads in southern Iran, and they've been doing a lot of that lately, destroying these bridges, and specifically they're destroying bridges that connect Fars province to Hormozgan. Hormuz is part of the name of it. Hormozgan is the region of Iran right around the Straits of Hormuz, and the U.S. is taking out the bridges that connect them. So let's see how this piece opens. Until just a few days ago, the U.S. strikes were largely focused on targets directly linked to Iran's military capabilities, including naval facilities, military infrastructure, weapon systems, and logistical support sites. The recent attacks on bridges and transportation routes in southern Iran suggest a notable shift in targeting. A notable shift in targeting. We're shifting now. The shift may be more significant than the attacks themselves. The shift may be more significant than the attacks themselves, meaning the fact that America has shifted from hitting military targets to hitting bridges and transportation routes. They're saying that shift may be more significant than the attacks themselves. WANA is telling its readers, don't just look at what was destroyed, look at what it means that this is what they chose to destroy. And then the piece goes on. Bridges are rarely among the first targets in an air campaign. They usually become priorities when military planners conclude that destroying weapons alone is no longer enough, and that disrupting the enemy's ability to move forces and supplies is equally important. Let's read a little bit more. This is why the latest strikes appear to signal more than a series of isolated air attacks. They may indicate the beginning of a new phase of the conflict, one in which logistics becomes the primary battlefield. This is the real anxiety in this piece. It's not really about the bridges. It's about not knowing what kind of war this has become, that the war is shifting. Listen to how they lay out the two possibilities. Let's find it. Because they continue here. Does this necessarily mean the United States is preparing for a ground invasion? Not necessarily. From a military perspective, targeting transportation infrastructure can serve two very different purposes. It may be intended to pave the way for a future ground operation, or it may simply be designed to reduce an opponent's operational flexibility and gradually wear down its military effectiveness in a prolonged war of attrition. They genuinely don't know which of those two it is. They do this all the time, where when they're speculating about what the Americans are doing, they'll write articles that lay out the various options. And it might seem silly. It might seem, I should say, counterproductive, like they're revealing their strategic thinking. But part of why they do this is I think it's part of their DNA as Persians, that they want to save face. And part of saving face and showing that they're smart is that they're not being fooled. And the way they show they're not being fooled is they lay out all the possible strategies. And that way, whatever happens, they can say, aha, you see, we knew it all along. You didn't fool us. But they tend to reveal a lot of their thinking. So they don't know what this is. It may be intended to pave the way for future ground operation, or it may be simply designed to reduce the opponent's operational flexibility, meaning the hitting of bridges. Which is it? Are they preparing a ground invasion, or are they just trying to harm our logistics? That uncertainty, is this a prelude to an invasion, or are they cutting off our supply chain? This is itself the source of the fear. The regime, they don't know exactly what the threat is. Okay, that's what this is. Let's keep going with this piece. One more quote here. What else did I want to read you here? I think it's down near the end. Here we go. Yeah, the very last line. At this stage of the war, the central contest may no longer be over territory itself, but over the lifelines that make military operations possible. That's the punchline of the piece, right? That's the closing thought of the article. They're not bragging about Iranian strength. It's not that kind of propaganda. This is the regime media quietly conceding that the war is shifting, and it's shifting into an area where they are structurally disadvantaged. Their ability to move fuel, troops, equipment along their own coastline is being compromised, and they're speculating about what this means going forward. Okay, which brings us to the last piece I want to share with you, and the title of it says it all. This is from today. The expanding Iran-US conflict, what may come next? Okay, that's this one. So it's very revealing piece because instead of reassuring anyone, it just lays out the trajectory in plain language. This is Iran's state media describing the war as widening and expanding. Okay, let's dive in. An assessment of recent military and political developments suggests that the confrontation between Iran and the United States has entered a new phase. The geographic scope of the conflict is expanding, new actors and targets have emerged, and the operational patterns of both sides have evolved compared to earlier stages. Okay? So they're saying it plainly. This is expanding. It's not shrinking. Let's keep going. And then they give a number, and they have a number of different developments. Number one, but they kind of run into each other. The United States has expanded its military operations beyond Iran's coastal areas and has begun targeting locations deeper inside Iranian territory. Watch my video from earlier today where I talk about some of those targets deep in Iranian territory, very far from the coastal areas, and what that means. So they say about this, a trend that is expected to intensify gradually. New targets reportedly include logistics and transportation networks, telecommunications towers, and military facilities. Okay, goes on. Let's read more of this. In response, Iran has also expanded its attacks against U.S. interests and assets, both in scale and sophistication. In addition to operations involving Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, and Qatar, there has been a growing focus on the U.S. military bases in Jordan, suggesting a shift beyond the operational pattern seen during the previous 40 days of the conflict. Furthermore, for the first time during the two most recent conflicts, U.S. positions in Syria have also reportedly come under attack. So look at what's on that list. Jordan, Syria, for the first time, right? This is they're telling their own public in a piece like this that the war is now bigger geographically than it was a few weeks ago, and it's including countries that weren't even included before. So it's growing. Okay, so the war is expanding. Let's jump down a little bit because we're not going to read the whole thing. Where is it? From Tehran's perspective, any country that allows its territory or infrastructure to be used for U.S. military operations may become part of Iran's deterrence equation. The scope of Iran's response is likely to remain proportional to the nature and scale of U.S. military actions. Should the conflict widen further, pressure on the United Arab Emirates could increase with additional locations inside the country, potentially becoming targets. Qatar and Oman may also face consequences depending on the extent of their involvement in support for U.S. military operations. Okay, this is Iran naming out loud every Gulf Arab state it's prepared to strike next, UAE, Qatar, Oman, depending on how far this goes. So this is not a show of confidence on their part. They are bracing for an expanded regional war, and they're warning their neighbors in advance. Okay, and now they turn their attention to Yemen and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Here we go. In the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, Ansar Allah, that's the Houthis, has reportedly begun movements and preparations aimed at attacking Saudi Arabia and increasing pressure along the strategically important Bab el-Mandeb shipping route. As the conflict expands, this front could emerge as another major flashpoint. I've talked about that in the last few days. And it actually escalated later today when the Houthis announced that they're putting a blockade on Saudi Arabia, whatever that means. We'll talk about that in a subsequent video, probably tomorrow. Israel has become the principal hub for the concentration of U.S. military equipment and weaponry. As efforts to reinforce Israel's arsenal continue and its target bank is updated, the likelihood of more direct Israeli involvement in the next phase of the conflict appears to be increasing. Whoa. So look at this last piece of the picture. The Houthis operating a front against Saudi Arabia, and we see that happening. And this is the one I'd put a red circle around. Iran's own media naming Israel as the principal hub for American buildup and saying direct Israeli involvement is now increasing in likelihood. I mean, they're expecting Israel, like that Israel's sitting on the sidelines, checking all their equipment and licking their chops and getting ready, and that Israel is going to get back in this. Iran is telling its own people to expect Israel to enter this more directly, not less. Okay, they're looking for that. So let's jump all the way down. Final paragraph. Taken together, these developments suggest that if current trends persist, the conflict is likely to expand geographically, with additional actors and new fronts becoming involved. The region may therefore be heading towards an even more volatile and consequential period. Whoa, that's the closing sentence of this piece. They're not reassuring them at all. They're not saying, oh yeah, we're still strong, meaning that here's what I'm noticing in all of these pieces. The usual Iranian tough talk of we're going to, anyone tries anything, we are ready. And, we're going to, and we're going to win. And what they're doing isn't working. They're not saying any of that in these pieces. They're not saying that they're losing, but there's none of that usual kind of bluster where they don't really, which shows that they don't really take their enemies seriously. So when you put all these three pieces side by side, here's what Iran is actually afraid of right now. Let's just keep this simple. Number one, they are afraid of a limited American ground invasion, a ground grab, not an occupation of Iran. That's not going to happen, but something like those Gulf islands, and that America wants to grab them and then use them as leverage. And they're admitting that they can't really rule that out. All they can say is, well, if they do that, it'll be really hard for them to hold them. And we're not like Iraq, right? But they're basically admitting that's a possibility. Number two, they're afraid of a slow strangulation campaign against their logistics, right? All the bridges being taken out, and realizing that they can't easily counter that. All they could do is speculate about, is this a sign of a ground invasion, or are they just trying to disrupt our logistics? They don't even know what the goal of it is, okay? And number three, the war stops being an Iran-U.S. war and becomes a regional war. You see, as long as it's the U.S. attacking them, the U.S. is very predictable. I mean, even Trump was unpredictable. When I say predictable, the U.S., they know what they're dealing with. So they're attacking Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan. They're attacking states that don't really have the capacity or who aren't going to attack them back. It's really just attacking American positions. And the Americans are the ones doing the retaliating. And that's why they've been avoiding attacking Israel and really also avoiding attacking UAE, because those two countries will actually hit them. And then it's a less controllable situation for them. They understand the American escalation. So the third thing that they fear is that this expands beyond it being an Iran-U.S. war, and it involves other Gulf states. And this escalation with the Houthis in Saudi Arabia is contributing to that. And Israel, and they definitely fear Israel stepping in more directly. So what I find most telling isn't any one of these fears. It's that all three of these fears showed up in Iranian state media in the same 48-hour window. So I think we're seeing more anxiety from the regime. It's a different tone than what we've seen throughout the war. Like I said, usually there's been this real blustery confidence that's come through, this defiant confidence that's come through their media. And in these pieces, we're not seeing it. I read this stuff every day, and it'll be interesting to see if that persists. So listen, if you want to understand this war, you don't just watch Washington or Fox News or whatever. You have to really pay attention to what the Iranians themselves are saying. And that's what I try to do here. So, I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found it interesting. And I'll see you on the next one. God bless.